Okay, today's daf we're going to be learning is Gittin daf Vav. Today's daf is sponsored by the Hadran Zoom family in honor of their three dear friends, each of whom revel in the glories of Hashem's world. Marsha Mormon scaled to the base camp of Everest, daf Yomi in her hand and Rabbanit Michelle in her ear. Judy Farber finished Shas, climbing through reams of pages over 7 years, and Debbie Gvir reclaimed her health again. Elena v'hatzlachna. And today's stuff is sponsored by Lawrence and Michelle Berkowitz in loving memory of Joy Rockbarger Balsam on her 19th year at site, a pioneer in women's Torah learning, whereby hundreds of her students continue to spread the light of Torah. Yehi Zichra Baruch. Okay, we're going to start with the bottom of Daf Hamubet. We started to see different opinions. Okay, there's a study guide for today, which will help kind of guide you through the structure of the daf. The first thing is a chart on the page of the different opinions regarding what part you have to see of the get in order to say that the get was written lishma. So the first opinion, we saw Bar Hedya came to Rabbi Achi, and Rabbi Achi said to him, you have to see every single letter that it was written lishma. To which Bar Hedya didn't like this answer. He went to a different group of rabbis, Rabbi Ami and Rabbi Asi, and they said to him, if you say something so strict like that, no way, no how does that have to be the case? Because then we're going to start, and this is always the problem. You're going to be so stringent, it's going to make all the other Gittin look like they weren't done properly. And then people will start saying these women aren't divorced, and that will be a huge problem. But they didn't exactly say what they do require, but we're going to see that further on, which is Rav Kahana, we see went to Rabbi Elazar to bring a get, and Rabbi Elazar told him, you just need to see one line of it written lishma. And now we're going to get to Rav Ashi Amar, very end of yesterday's daf, now already at the top of ours. Afilu kan kul misabek hamegilta. Even if you hear the sound of the quill and the sound of the writing on the Megillah, on the parchment, that's enough. You just have to hear. I was thinking this reminds me of those sugyot we saw a lot about the interplay between hearing and seeing. So particularly we talked about, I remember in the Masechet Shkalim, and maybe also in Chagiga, where it was all about going to the Riyat Pnei Hashem, and there was the hearing and the seeing. Anyway, here we're switching. You don't have to see it, you just need to hear it. Tanya Kavatei de Rav Ashi, here's a braita to support Rav Ashi's reading. Hamivi get mimedinat hayam. We're going to read this braita. We're going to read the part that has to do with us, but we're also going to read the rest of it, and then we're going to have to deal with what does the rest of it mean. So we're going to have two aspects of what we're going to do with this braita. First, we're just going to read it for what we need it for, but then we're going to deal with that last line, which doesn't make so much sense. Hamivi get mimedinat hayam. If you bring a get from abroad, afilu hu babayit v'sofer ba'aliyah. Even if when it was written, you were in the house, which means the main floor, and the scribe was in the top floor. Hu ba'aliyah v'sofer babayit, or the reverse. You were upstairs and the sofer was downstairs. Afilu nichnas v'yotzei kol hayom. Even if he was going in and out all day long, who is he? It's a good question. It's not clear. We'll get back to this line in a minute. Kashel. So now, what do you see? This kind of a get is okay, even though hu b'bayit v'sofer ba'aliyah halo kachazele. If you were upstairs and he was downstairs, or the reverse, there's no way you're going to be seeing anything. So elalav kigon shesham dishama kan kul misabek hamegilta. It must be that you heard the action of the writing, and then of course you have to know that it's written lishma. You have to know somehow. Maybe you saw the guy go upstairs to write the get for his wife. You have to somehow know that it was done lishma. But the point is, as long as you hear the writing of it, knowing it's being done for this particular person and his particular wife, this particular wife that we're discussing, then it's sufficient. Now, Amar Mar is just quoting. It's a way of saying open quotes of something we mentioned in this braita that wasn't very clear. Amar Mar, afilu nichnas v'yotzei kol hayom kulo kasher. So now, even if he goes in and out all day, it's fine. Now, what's the obvious? He must be talking about the shaliach. That's what we were talking about. He was the subject of what the discussion was. So ma, who is this person who's going in and out all day? If you would say the messenger, which is the guy we were talking about, he could be upstairs and the sofer is downstairs, or the reverse, and it's still enough he could say it. He could even be going in and out all day. But the Gemara says, if he can't see him at all and it's okay, Amarit Kashel, you said it was fine. Nichnas v'yotzei mebayeh. Assuming nichnas v'yotzei means if you were in the room when the sofer was writing and then you left, and then you went back in the room and then you left. Well, if you don't even have to be in the room, then of course, if you were in the room part of the time and left, it shouldn't make a difference. It shouldn't be a problem. So you don't even need to tell us that case. It's totally unnecessary. So therefore, Ela Sofer. It must be, we're talking about the sofer goes in and out, to which the Gemara still has a problem with that. Pshita, isn't that obvious? Mishum de nechnas v'yotzei nefsaline. We're going to disqualify him because he went in and out of the house. If I'm a sofer and I'm writing a get and I write it for this person, and then I stop, I take a break, I go out, I come back, well, why would it be a problem? Whoever says you have to write it from beginning to end in one sitting? So they answer, the point is, you didn't just go out for a breath of fresh air. You went to go to the shuk. So what? Well, Mahu Detema, you might have thought, if you're a sofer and you go to the shuk, what might happen? You might meet someone who's got the exact same name, and his wife has the exact same name as the previous, right, as the one you've been in the middle of writing. So you're in the middle of writing a get. You meet someone, the shuk, who says desperately, I need a get right now. And my name is this, and my wife's name is this. You say, oh, perfect. I'm in the middle of writing a get right now. I can give you that one, and I'll rewrite a new one for the other person. Maybe he offered him more money. I don't know. But basically, you might have thought we have to be concerned that if you went out to the shuk, maybe you found someone who wants that get. Hamashmalan, therefore, comes to teach you, no, you don't have to worry about the off chance that you happen to go to the shuk, meet someone who specifically needs this get and needs it right now, and no. You can go to the shuk in the middle and come back, and we're not worried that it's no longer going to be lishma. Okay, so first sugya was finishing up this sugya about what of the writing has to be seen or heard, even possibly, by the person who's the messenger, who comes to say, B'fanai nechtav, it was written in front of me, and I know it was written lishma. The next section, and from here really till the end of the daf, we're going to be dealing with Babylonia. And I know, Becky, you've been waiting for this. You asked this a few days ago. What is the status of Babylonia? Now, again, you have to remember history. History is very important here, because in the time of the Mishnah, when they said basically it's Israel and that's it, the center of everything was in Israel. Yes, it's true there were Jews living in Babylonia and it was building up, but really the center was in Israel. Everything shifts when Rav comes to Babylonia. We're even going to see it in our daf today. Michi ata Rav leBavel. Okay, it's one of these statements that comes up all the time. Ki ata Rav leBavel. Okay, or Michi ata, which is from the moment he came, everything shifted because Rav builds a big Beit Midrash, and students start flocking to Babylonia to be studying, and Bavel becomes the center. At that time in history, okay, in the time first, second, even third generation Amoraim, there's a lot of conflict between where's the centrality of the power. All sorts of, we talked about this before, all sorts of halachot developed then, like burial in Israel, for example. And Kiddush HaChodesh can only be done in Israel. And this is because the people in Israel are trying to say, we're still the center, when it's clear that the Babylonians are really becoming the center. Also, things weren't so good in Israel, and they were being chased out. And life was much better in Babylonia, and the Jews thrived there. And that understanding, that whole background, is very important to understanding the sugya. And in fact, the big machloket about what the status of Bavel starts in the time of Rav and Shmuel, who were the first Amoraim, and particularly Rav, who sets up this first yeshiva, right? Shmuel also becomes a Rosh Yeshiva there in a different city. Anyway, Itmar. So it was said, Itmar is always, it was said, but it really usually almost always is used as an introduction to a machloket between two Amoraim, a debate between them. Bavel. Here's the topic. The topic is Babylonia, and what's its status when it comes to get. Rav says, which makes sense that Rav says this, right? He comes in, says Babylonia is now the center, and therefore it has the same status as Israel. Shmuel Amar kechutz laaretz. Shmuel says, what are you talking about? It's like outside of Israel. It's outside Israel. It has all the laws of all the places that are outside Israel. So, we're going to see this over and over again. We've seen this already a number of times. Is this not the root of the machloket? Demar savar lefisha ein bekiyin lishma. Rav says the issue is bekiyin lishma. They weren't, right? The issue in Babylonia was that they didn't know the laws of lishma or didn't accept it. And obviously, once Rav comes to Bavel, Hane Gemire, everybody knew it at this point. Umar savar lefisha ein dimitzuim lakaimo v'hane nami lo shchiche. And Shmuel must say it's a matter of being able to verify the signatures. The Babylonia and Israel are still far apart. And therefore, it's not going to be easy to verify the signatures. V'tizbera, what are you talking about? Is this really true? No way, no how. V'ha Rabba ile de Rava. Remember, Rabba, who holds Lishma, also says that you need Eidim Mitzuyim L'Kaima. We already established that on Daf Dalet. So once you establish that, you can't say that's the machloket, and the only issue is Lishma, because even to the person who thinks Lishma is the issue, also you need to make sure you have witnesses. So, everybody thinks the issue is, are we going to have witnesses or not? And here comes a very interesting debate. Rav says, since there's yeshivot, people are going back and forth. Now, you could say back and forth, Israel, Babylonia, or even more so, if you remember, Medina in Israel, from one country to another, or one area, the north to the south, Galil to Judea, maybe. You don't need to say the Fananechta. But Medina and Bavel you do. But if Bavel is like Israel, then you go from one main city or one main area to a different. If you say it's like Israel, you won't need to do that. And why is that? Because people are traveling from yeshiva to yeshiva in the country, right? What we're going to say, according to this explanation, is it's all about the yeshivas. The rabbis view that as the center of everything. And because there's a lot of people going back and forth in the country now, traveling from yeshiva to learn, therefore they recognize the signatures of others. That's Rav. Shmuel Saval, this is a good, interesting debate about what your perception of yeshiva students. Mitiv to bigger sayu tree day. The people in the yeshivas are very busy with their learning. They don't pay attention to people's signatures. They're not business people. They're not doing deals all the time and signing documents. They're busy with their learning. They're not paying attention at all to signatures. So the fact that they're going from one place to another has no bearing on being able to recognize signatures of other people, which again means if I'm in one city and a get comes to me and the husband comes and says, this is not a good get, and we try to find people who know the signatures, it's going to be very difficult because the people who maybe had been into the city where the get was brought from, they don't recognize signatures of anybody. That's what Shmuel says. Remember this concept of they're focused on one thing, and that means they're not focused on the signatures. We're going to come back to this later also, not about people learning in yeshiva, but other people who are focused on one thing and therefore not focused on recognizing signatures. Itmar Nami. Now, I told you Itmar is usually used as an introduction to an Amora-Edic debate. But sometimes Itmar comes by itself and it doesn't mean that. But sometimes you have Itmar Nami. Itmar Nami just means, and furthermore it was said, which means we're going to support what we just said. What about what we just said? We just brought a machloket. Well, what we're going to support is the debate, Rav and Shmuel, really has to do with the yeshivas. The fact that there's a lot of yeshivas. That's what shifted things. Okay, and that's what caused Rav to think that Babylonia is going to be treated like Israel. Amar Rabbi Abba Amar Rav Huna, Asinu, and this statement is going to support this. Asinu atzmeinu beBavel ke'eretz Yisrael legitin. So basically they're saying like what Rav said, which is we decided that Babylonia is going to be treated like Israel when it comes to a get. And you're not going to need to say it was written in front of me, it was signed in front of me. Michi ata Rav leBavel. I told you we get to this line. From the moment that Rav came to Babylonia, which means, again, it's all based on the yeshivas, because the whole moving of Rav to Bavel meant that we're creating central yeshivas. And yes, Shmuel's yeshiva was, I believe, already in existence when Rav came, but it wasn't as important. In other words, that's the whole thing. They always go back to Rav, that when he came to Babylonia, he brought the masses. He brought the Torah, the very solid Torah learning that brought everybody to flock to Babylonia. Mativ Rabbi and Raba. Now we're going to have a question on Rav from the Mishnah, which, by the way, I described it is a little bit strange to question it from the Mishnah because we're basically saying that things change. And not just the way I described it, but the way that Rabbi Abba and the neighbor of Rav Huna just described it, that it all switched when Rav came to Bavel, which was after the Mishnah was written. But they're going to still question from the Mishnah because just because the Mishnah was written before, still maybe the Mishnah should still apply. So our Mishnah says, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Mirekem lamizrach v'rekem kamizrach. If you remember, Rabbi Yehuda delineates the borders of Israel. Rekem and east, it's all, right? It's all like outside of Israel. Ashkelon l'darom, Ashkelon to the south, Ashkelon kidarom, and Ashkelon itself is considered outside of Israel. Me'ako l'tzafon v'ako kitzafon, from Akko north, and Akko is considered like the north. And now they stop the quote, and here he explains. Babylonia is north of Israel. How do we know this? They don't take out a map. What do? They take out a pasuk. Pasuk in Yirmiyahu, first chapter of Yirmiyahu, very famous pasuk. God says to me, from the north, the bad is going to come. He's talking about Nebuchadnezzar who's coming from Babylonia. It's going to come from the north. So they're in the north. So number one, we have Rabbi Yehuda who delineates all the borders and basically says anything north of here is outside of Israel and isn't treated like Israel. Utnan. And furthermore, even the one who disagrees with Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Meir Omer, Akko ke'eretz Yisrael Gittin, Akko is considered like Israel for the issue of gets. Afilu Rabbi Meir lo ka'amal, ela ba'akko d'mekarva. He only said it for Akko, which is close, but Bavel d'mercha kalo. But Babylonia, which is much farther away than Akko, no. So who motive la v'hu mefarik. So now he asked this question with Yirmiyah, but he answers his own question. And what does he say? Levar mi Bavel. Basically, this Mishnah is telling you these are the boundaries of Israel. Anything outside of this is considered like abroad, other than Babylonia. Okay, which makes sense because what they're saying is Babylonia became like Israel. So yes, it's true, we need these borders, but there's one big exception to the rule, and that's the big country of Babylonia, which since there's a lot of Jews there, and since that becomes the center, and therefore we're going to assume also people go from place to place, they travel. We're going to see also they travel to Israel a lot, maybe because of that also. And we'll be able to validate their signatures as opposed to places that are more, less populated, and therefore less likely people are coming from there to Israel, and less likely people will recognize their signatures, or even place to place, right? Not just from there to Israel, but from place to place within their country. Well, if they delineated the borders of Israel in the Mishnah, so what are the delineated borders of Babylonia? Amarav, again, without maps and clear boundaries, right? And also, as we know, sometimes countries change boundaries all the time, who's in charge in what area. So what's considered Babylonia? This won't help us too much, but Amarav, Papa kimachloket liyuchasin, kach machloket legitin. You might remember we talked about this about yuchasin, that when it comes to marriage and who's considered they have good lineage, right? They always say Bavel, in Babylonia, they have the best lineage, okay? It's considered the highest in terms of lineage, in terms of most people do not come from slaves or from mamzerim or things like that. And there's a machloket, and Babylonia is considered the best there. The question is, what is Babylonia? And there's a debate about where the borders are for Yuchsin. So Papa says, whatever the machloket is there, that's the machloket here. We have the same debate here. But Rav Yosef disagrees and says, machloket liyuchsin. Yeah, yuchsin, there's a whole machloket about it. But legitin, divrei hakol, everyone agrees when it comes to get, ad arba tinyana digishla. Okay, there's different explanations of this. Some people say it's the second arch by the bridge, okay, by this bridge. Obviously, it was someplace that everybody knew what he was talking about. Okay, and he says that's basically the border. It's interesting. They obviously had an issue about the border in one direction, right? The borders maybe on the other side were very clear because he's obviously only, right? Usually you need borders all around. He's only saying one place. I guess that was where the issue was. Okay, that's the boundaries of Bavel, which didn't really help us too much, but we're going to move on. Rav Chisda, right? Obviously for them it was very relevant because they all knew the boundaries. They all knew these places. They knew exactly what they were. They understood exactly what they were talking about. Rav Chisda matzrich me'aktisfon lebe ardishi. He says when you go from aktisfon to ardishi, be ardishil, and you bring a get, you have to say b'fanei nefta b'fanei nefta. These are obviously two cities in Babylonia. Umi be ardishir la aktisfon lo matzrich. But when you're coming from Ardishir and you're going to Aktisfon, you don't need to. So this is strange. We have two places, and in one direction you have to say it, in the other direction you don't have to say it. So what's the difference? So our go-to, our first go-to, which we always reject, is maybe the issue is lishma and lo lishma. So when you bring from Aktisfon to Be Ardishir, you have to say it because the people in Aktisfon don't know the halacha of lishma. And the people in Be Ardishir do, and that's why when you bring to Be Ardishir to Aktisfon, you don't have to say. But obviously, you know what the Gemara is going to say. V'tizbera, how could that possibly be? V'ha Rabbi le de Rava. But isn't the issue, doesn't Rava also think that not only you have to worry about Lishma, you also have to worry that there's aiding? Now we have something strange, because if it's both directions, and one direction needs it, the other doesn't. Well, if people go back and forth, then they should know either they know the signatures or they don't know the signatures. So how could it be that you need it in one direction, not if you're going in the other? So like we keep saying, everybody obviously needs also the issue of the signatures. Now we're going to say the following. There was a shuk in Aktisfon, but there was no shuk in Be Ardishir. all the people in Be'ar Dashir would go to Akdisfon for the shuk. So when they would bring their documents, their gets from Be'ar Dashir to Akdisfon, they didn't need to say B'fanei Nechtam, B'fanei Nechtam, because the shuk was in Akdisfon. And in Akdisfon, they all knew the signatures of the people in Be'ar Dashir because they were constantly buying things from them, signing on documents. Let's say you buy on credit, so you have to sign. Okay, they all knew. But in Be'ar Dashir, they didn't know the signatures of the people in Akdisfon. So if you're coming from Akdisfon to Be'ar Dashir, you would have to say. Now, why don't they know the signatures? Remember what we said before about the yeshiva students, they're so focused on their learning, they're not paying attention to signatures. Well, the people in Be'ar Dashir, when they come to Akdisfon and theoretically are congregating with other people, my time at Beshukayu Tride, they're busy shopping. They're not paying attention to signatures. They're just trying to get their food for their families and clothes and whatever else it is. They're not focused on the signatures. So that's why in Be'ar Dashir, they don't recognize signatures, and in Akdisfon they do. So if you bring from Be'ar Dashir to Akdisfon, losing my thought for a minute. If you bring from Be'ar Dashir to Akdisfon, you don't need to say anything because the people in Akdisfon know the signatures. But if you go the reverse direction, it doesn't work. This is one of those sugyas of Be'ar Dashir, Akdisfon. It's very confusing. Okay, next. We're now going to have three different people who required it to be said, this b'fanei nechtam, in very strange circumstances. You'll find this very surprising. Then we'll have an explanation, which kind of sounds like it's only on the third, but some of the commentaries think it's really describing all three. Rabba baravua matzrich me arsa la arsa. What is arsa la arsa? Rashi says, very strangely, that it's one row of houses divided with, there's Reshut Harabim, a huge public boulevard in the middle, and the other side of the street. So if you bring from one side of the Reshut Harabim to the other side, right, it's not like a small street, we're talking about a big street, but still, okay, one side of the street to the other side of the street, you have to say, b'fanei nechtam, b'fanei nechtam. Rav Shesha matzrich mishchuna l'shchuna. He said from neighborhood to neighborhood, which also isn't very far. And Rava matzrich b'ota shchuna. He requires even within the same neighborhood. So now they're going to ask about Rava specifically. As I said, though, perhaps the answer will apply to all of them. But Rava himself said it's all about finding witnesses. So if you're in the same neighborhood, why on earth would you be worried that you weren't going to find witnesses? Where to find witnesses in your neighborhood? Well, Shane b'nei Mechoza denied it. The people in Mechoza travel all the time for work. Because they travel all the time for work, so they're not around the locals at all. They don't recognize the signatures of the locals. And also, if you're trying to find their signatures, they might be away at that point, right? They might be traveling. And then this poor woman won't be able to get remarried because she's waiting for you to get back from your year-long trip. And, then what are we supposed to do? So because they traveled a lot, number one, they didn't know signatures. Number two, they wouldn't necessarily be around for us to validate their signatures. And that perhaps could be the explanation for all three of us. Rav Chanin Mishtai. Rav Chanin told the following story. Rav Kahana, I Tegita. So Rav Chanin starts telling about Rav Kahana. He brought a get. And when Rav Kahana brought a get, Lo Yadana. So Rav Chanin says, I don't remember the details of the story. This happens very often. I wasn't sure which direction the get was going. From this city to that city. These are two very big cities in Babylonia. Was it from Surah to Nahardea? Was it from Nahardea to Surah? Ata the Kamei de Rav. So the get comes before Rav. And Rav Kahana brings it to Rav, and he asks him, Amalei, Strichna lememar b'fanei nechtam olot strichna. Do I need to say this or not? Now we're talking about two cities in Babylonia. What would Rav say? Babylonia is like Israel. You shouldn't need to say it. Well, let's see what Rav says. Amalei lot strichat. Okay, that fits perfectly. He says you don't need to say it. Turning now to Amud Bet. V'i avadit ahani. But if you do, it'll be helpful. Okay? So, ma'i avadit ahani. If you do, it will be helpful. What will it be helpful for? Well, what's the whole issue here? We're worried that the husband might come and say that the get's not a good get, right? Either it wasn't lishma, the one signed or forgery, and he'll force it, right? He'll prevent his wife from getting remarried, or she'll already be remarried, and he'll try to say you're actually still married to me, in which case, right, you're an adulterer because you're with some other man, and your kids will be mamzerim, all that. In general, we said, well, in certain places, we don't need to worry about this. Now, it's not that we don't need to worry about it. The husband could still come and make an issue, but we'll deal with it. If he claims it wasn't lishma, we can assume people do it lishma here. And if the issue is we won't, right, that we need to verify the signatures of the witnesses, okay, so we'll go find the witnesses. So Rav basically says that even though you don't need to say because we could go find the witnesses and we can assume it was done lishma. But if you do it and the husband shows up and complains, you've saved us the process of having to verify the signatures of the witnesses. So we don't have to start looking around. We can just throw the husband out of court right away and just say, there's nothing to what you're saying because the witness already said, b'fanei nechta. Okay, so that's what Rav is basically saying. So even though we don't need to say it, Rav is saying if you say it, it's actually very helpful. Tanya, as we see, so Rav says, I'm going to prove this from the following braita, where the Gemara is basically supporting Rav from a braita. We don't know if Rav actually said this himself. So there was a case where someone brought a get before Rabbi Yishmael. So now we're going back to the Tanaitic time period. Amarlo. So we said to him when he brought the get, now presumably they were in Israel. Right? Rabbi Yishmael was in Israel. So he says, do I need to say it or not? Amarlo, b'ni mehechanata. He says, where are you bringing this get from? Amarlo, Rebbe, mi Kfar Sisai. I'm from Kfar Sisai. We don't yet know exactly where it is. We'll see this soon. Amarlo, tzarich atar lomar b'fanai neftam shelo tizakek le'edim. He says you need to say it so that the wife won't have to go struggling to find witnesses if the husband were to come and try to claim the get was not a good get. So basically what he's saying is, you don't really need this, but you should say it because it'll help the woman down the road. That already proves what Rav said, which is you don't really need to, but better to do it if you can. So the story continues. After he walked out of the room, this shaliach, nichnas lefanav Rabbi Eli. Rabbi Eli comes in before Rabbi Yishmael. Now he heard what happened in the room. Someone told him what had happened. And Amarlo, Rebbe, I don't understand. Halok farsi sai muvlat betchum Eretz Yisrael ukorval tzipori yoter me'ako. I don't understand why you made this guy say it. Isn't Kfar Sisai within? Okay, we talked about the muvlat, right? Where you have muvlat betchum means that it's right. There's the borders, and the borders aren't straight. And if you were to draw a straight line, it would actually be considered in the border of Israel. And kroval tzipori yoter me'ako. It's closer to Tzipori than it is to Akko. Okay, this is basically, and Akko, it's closer to Israel than Akko is. And Akko, Utznan, it says in the Mishnah, and now, by the way, just so you know what's going on, we quoted a braita with this story. We're in the middle of the braita. The Gemara stops the braita and wants to explain to us what the relevance of him saying it's closer to Tzipori than it is to Akko. So stop the braita for a minute, parentheses. Utznan, and when it comes to Akko, the Mishnah says, Rabbi Meir, Omer, Akko ke'eretz Yisrael Gittin. Remember, Rabbi Meir says Akko, there was a whole debate. And Rabbi Meir says Akko is like Israel, even though the rabbis didn't think so. But when the rabbis say Akko is like outside of Israel, they were only talking about Akko, which is far from the mainland of Israel. But in other words, it's obviously it's in Israel, but it's far from where the people were really living. But Kfar Sisai is closer than Akko. It's closer to Tzipori than Akko, we just said. And that's what this is coming to explain. It's closer to Tzipori than Akko is. And therefore, it should definitely be considered that you don't need to say b'fanei nechta. Now, it's a little bit strange because Rabbi Yishmael already explained that he didn't require it for the reasons of halacha, right? He required it to help the woman. But for whatever reason, which we'll see soon, Rabbi Eli questions him and says, why are you requiring this? Thinking that Rabbi Yishmael needed it from a halachic perspective, that this is considered like outside of Israel. And he said, I don't get it. It's definitely should be considered in Israel for this purpose. So Amarlo, he said to him, Shtok v'nishtok ho'il v'yatza hadavar behetel yatza. Silence, my child. Silence. I already ruled on this. I already permitted. Okay, what does mean permitted? It means I told him to say it to make the woman's life easier, basically. And it's already a done deal, so just let it go. But really saying that I did it also lahatil, to make it easier for this woman. So now the Gemara asks, okay, that was back to the braita, right? We took a break in the braita to explain what he meant that Tzipori was closer to Parsi side of Tzipori than Akko. Why is that a relevant point? They explained to us why it was a relevant point. Then we went back to the story with the last line. Now the Gemara wants to know, but why did Rabbi Eli start questioning Rabbi Yishmael when Rabbi Yishmael himself already explained why he did it? He said it's so that the woman won't need to look around for aiding. So Rabbi Eli's question is totally out of place. To which they answer, Lo simu kameh. What happened? Rabbi Eli wasn't in the room at the time. He was outside. When the guy came out, either the guy told him what happened in the room or someone told him what happened. But as we all know, when people tell over information, right? This is what you call broken telephone. Like they don't give all the information, okay? So he told him that he had to say b'fanei neftam, or somebody told him that Rabbi Yishmael ruled you have to say b'fanei neftam. But they didn't say because so that the woman doesn't need witnesses, meaning not really that you need to do it for a halachic reason, just because I'd like to protect the woman and make it easier for her down the road. So Rabbi Eli didn't hear that, and that's why he was questioning Rabbi Yishmael. This is almost like they're telling you a good lesson in terms of, and we're going to talk about communication when it comes to the end of today's daf, the importance of communication, which obviously in Masechet like Gittin is a very important message to get through, which is, how important communication is in relationships. But that's already not so much coming out of here, but it is already discussing this issue of talking and without actually getting out the words properly or getting out what you mean. Shalach le Rabbi Evyatar le Rav Kahana. We're going to see more of this issue of communication at the end of the daf. From here till the end of the daf, we're going to be talking about Rabbi Evyatar. We're going to see a story about him, then we're going to question something about him, and then we're going to go off on a whole tangent about him, and really off topic. First is on topic. So Rabbi Evyatar, who's in Israel, sends a message to Rav Kahana, who's in Babylonia. Gittin haba'im misham lekan. If you're bringing a get from Babylonia to Israel, ein tzarich lamar b'fanei neftam b'fanei neftam. You don't need to say b'fanei neftam. This sounds like Rav, basically. Lema kasaval lefi she'ein b'kiyin lishma v'hanei gemire. Gemara still won't give up on saying this every time, which is, it seems like the issue is lishma, and in Babylonia, they know the halacha of lishma. But we already know at this point what the Gemara is going to say. V'tizbara, is that really so? V'harabi ilay de Rava, but Rava also doesn't only think you need the issue of lishma. He also says that you need l'kayem etzat chatimot, right? So you need the witnesses to be able to verify, right? We won't be able to find witnesses to verify the signatures. So how do we explain this? Everyone agrees being on the kaim. You need to say b'fanei neftam for the purposes of kiyum of the witnesses. So why wouldn't you need this? Well, kevan de'ika rabim desalke v'nachte mishchaf shchiche. Before we were talking about within Babylonia. Now we're getting to from Babylonia to Israel. And what do they say? Well, there's always people, and we see them all the time in the Gemara, who are going from place to place. They're going from Israel to Babylonia, from Babylonia to Israel. So those people, right, we know them, they're bringing the Torah from one place to the other, right? They always tell us, right, when he came here, he told us, blah, blah, blah. This is what Rabbi Yochanan said. This is what Rabbi Lakish said. So they also, right, because people are going back and forth, you can verify signatures. It's not so difficult. Okay, there was a lot of traffic between Babylonia and Israel. Amar Rabbi Yosef. So basically, before we move on to Rabbi Yosef, what we have is Rabbi Evyatar basically ruling that if witnesses come, a messenger comes from Babylonia to Israel, he doesn't need to say b'fanei neftam, b'fanei neftam. Rabbi Yosef apparently doesn't like this, and he says the following: Amar Rabbi Yosef, man lemalan to Rabbi Evyatar bar samchahu. Who made him in charge? Who says this guy is a reliable guy? Right? This happens all the time. A rabbi rules, and another rabbi says, "Who is he to rule?" Right? Why should we accept what he has to say? Ve'od. And furthermore, if you think he is, well, I'm going to tell you something bad about him. Okay? You might not think this is the world's most terrible thing, but Rav Yosef is going to be bothered by this. Ha'ihu deshalach leila Rav Yehuda. He wrote a letter once to Rav Yehuda, and it's not the content of the letter that's going to be a problem. You'll see, even though the content itself is a little disturbing. B'nei Adam ha'olim misham lekan. He wrote to Rav Yehuda and said, the people in Babylonia who come to study in Israel, they come to study Torah. And what do? They leave behind their families and they go to Israel to learn Torah. And you think this is a good thing? Well, Hein kimu ba'atzmam, they fulfilled the following pasuk by themselves. Vayitnu hayela b'zona v'yadam achlu b'yayim vayishtu. They sold the child for prostitution, the daughter they sold for wine, and they drank it. Okay, which basically means, well, I shouldn't say it basically means. There's many different commentaries here. There's commentaries who think this is a positive pasuk, that they're willing to sacrifice their children to learn Torah, and that's a good thing. Okay, some people say it like that. Very hard for me to believe. I think it's the Meiri. It's a positive twist on this. Very hard for me to believe that they're using a pasuk about prostitution and selling their daughters for wine and saying this is a positive pasuk. The other approach is to say that either they're causing their children to engage in prostitution and wine and all that in order to make money because they have to support themselves, right? Or they basically sold them for prostitution, and however you define it, it sounds like they're abandoning their families, and that's not a good thing. Okay, but it's not the content of what he said that is bothersome. What's the problem? Katav le below sirtut. He wrote this letter on parchment without making lines. Okay, now what's the issue here? Well, Amar Rabbi Yitzchak says, Shtayim kotvim, shalosh ein kotvim. You're going to write a letter. Presumably, we're talking about a letter with psukim in it, something of content, of sanctified content. So here was a pasuk he was quoting. And if you write 2 words, you can write it without sirtut. But 3 already, you need lines. Why is this, right? Imagine you try to write on not lined paper. You could probably write 2 words in a straight line. But once you get to 3, right, it's going to start angling down or angling up, and it's very hard to keep a straight line. So the halacha is, in order that these documents look proper, and by the way, this is one of the halachot of a get. A get needs sirtut, so connecting also to a get, where it has to have lines. Okay, if you look up and you Google a get and look up online a photo of one, you should definitely do that. By the way, this reminds me, Gita's introduction went up yesterday on Gittin. One of the, besides all the great content that's in her introduction, she brings a get and a translation of a get. So you should look there and see. But if you want to look at a photo of a get and see the lines on it, you can also do that. That you can Google. In any case, the idea here is that when you write a letter, you have to have sirtut, and he wrote it without the sirtut. And because of that, very interestingly, who is it? Rav Yosef wants to basically discredit him and say, look, he didn't know about what Rabbi Yitzchak said. He didn't write sirtut, and how could we possibly hold like this guy? To which Abaye, and by the way, so Rabbi Yitzchak says, Shtayim kotvim, shalosh ein kotvim, and b'manita tana, there's a braita that says, shalosh kotvim, arba ein kotvim. You can write 3 words, you can't write 4. So now, Amar le Abaye. Abaye comes out to support Rabbi Evyatar in 2 ways. Number 1, he says, Atu kol lo yada hada Rabbi Yitzchak lav gavarabahu. What, anyone who doesn't keep the statement of Rabbi Yitzchak is not an important person? Come on. That's some halacha that Rabbi Yitzchak said, so he doesn't know about him. That's not going to make us postle him and say this guy is no good and we can't accept his psak. And Bishlama, and he says the following: I understand Bishlama milta detalya b'svar lachai. If it's logical, I get it. Which, by the way, you could say this is logical, but he didn't view this halacha as logical. Ha gemarahi. This is a tradition. Well, gemara lo shmiele. You could just say he didn't have this tradition. Not the biggest deal. So, number 1, I don't like the way you discredited him. It's not really such a real valid reason to discredit. Ve'od, and here's going to get into our interesting story. Rabbi Evyatar hu da'askim mare al yad. God himself approved of something Rabbi Evyatar said. Wow, how is that, and how do we know this? Well, dichtiv. And now we get to the story of Pilegesh B'Giva, an absolutely crazy story in the prophets, right? It's written in Sefer Shoftim, the very end of Sefer Shoftim. There's a man who has a concubine. The concubine, it says, Vatizne alav pilagsho, which sounds like she engaged in znut. But it's very hard to understand that she really engaged in znut, because what happens? As a result of whatever this Vatizne alav pilagsho, which is going to be the whole issue, what is that? As a result of it, she runs away for 4 months. She leaves her again, I don't know if you call it husband, although the Gemara kind of call it, both the Gemara and the Torah calls the prophet, the Sefer Shoftim calls him Isha, her husband. But anyway, he basically follows her after 4 months, tries to get her from her father's house. He manages to get her out, and they go, and on the way back, they stop in this place. It was by Sheva ben Yamin, and people won't let them in, and then this guy lets them in, and it's very much like the Lot story. And then basically he offers the concubine instead of him coming out. And basically they rape her, and it's this horrible story, and she falls on his doorstep. And then the horrible part is he chops her up into 12 pieces and basically distributes her all around the country to say what a terrible thing has been done in our country. And then there starts a civil war and people die. So that's in a very quick version of the story. So it says, so the fact that he goes after her makes them think that she really wasn't involved in real znut. Okay, it must have been something else, because otherwise, why would he have gone to find her again, and bring her back? Rabbi Evyatar amar zvuv matzala. He found a bee, a bug, or a bee in the food. Okay, there were bugs in the food or bees in the food. Rabbi Yonatan, that's what got him angry. Or a fly, thank you. That was the word I couldn't come up with, a fly in the food. Rabbi Yonatan amar nima matzala. He found a hair. Okay, we're going to see, it was the hair in the food, it was the hair in her private parts, which got in the way while they were having relations. So now notice, maybe you didn't focus on this, Rabbi Evyatar is having a debate with Rabbi Yonatan. So here's our Rabbi Evyatar about what this tizne was. So now Rabbi Evyatar bumps into Eliyahu. Now we're going to get how we know what God said. Well, let's hear what happens. Amarle. And there's a very famous line in the story, which is why you might have actually heard this story. If not, you'll see though this famous line that you do know from the story, which appears in other sugyot as well, but here's one of the places. So he says, when you bump into Eliyahu, what's this question you're going to ask, right? What's God doing right now? He's learning the story of Pilegesh Begiba. Umay Kamar, so what's God saying about the story? Rabbi Evyatar wants to know. Amarle says, this is what God is saying. Evyatar b'ni kachu omer. He's talking about you. This is what Evyatar says. Yonatan b'ni kachu omer. This is the way Yonatan explains it. Amarle, Rabbi Evyatar, instead of being thrilled that God is mentioning him in heaven, he says, what a terrible thing. What do we always want Eliyahu to do? To come and tell us what the real answer is. And you're telling me that God doesn't even know the real answer? How could God not be sure what the proper way to translate this? Amar le, he answers to Eliyahu, Elu ve'elu divrei Elohim chayim. They're both the living Torah of God. Okay, they're both right. Can that be? And here you see that he already said, Evyatar, right? God agreed with what Evyatar said. Even though we're going to see Evyatar's was the lesser important one. Why? Zvuv matzah b'lo hikpid, nima matzah ve'ikpid. First he found the zvuv and he didn't really care about the fly. But then there was a hair, and that he really got upset about. That was kind of what the straw that broke the camel's back. Amar Rav Yehuda. So now Rav Yehuda explains, Zvuv b'ka'ara nima b'oto makom. Rav Yehuda says Zvuv was in the food, the fly was in the food, and the hair was oto makom, meaning was while they were having relations. Zvuv me'isuta nema sakanta. The Zvuv wasn't the biggest deal because it was just gross, but the hair was actually dangerous. Ika da'amre. Some people say idi b'idi b'ka'ara. Both were in the food. Right, we have hairs in food, and that's disgusting also. And what's the difference between the zvuv and the hair? Well, zvuv onsa, the zvuv, the fly gets in there. It wasn't her fault. But nima pshiuta, but the hair got in there. That was her fault. Right? I'm thinking of my house, right? When there's a hair in the food, and all the kids complain, what's a hair doing in my food? Right? Someone's fault, probably usually mine, for not putting my hair back while I was cooking. So now, Amar Rav Chisda. What are lessons we can learn from the story? Already we got to the main point of our story, which is Abaye said, look, God even agreed with Evyatar. So here you have it. Now, Rav Chisda comes and says, we're going to learn something from the story. And here we start getting some marital advice, which you would have expected to get in Masechet Gittin. You're not going to see a lot of it, but here's some. What you learn from Pilegesh Begiba is do not put the fear, don't scare your wife. Okay, don't be very harsh with her that she's so scared, like in this story. Right? Something happened. There was a fly in the food, or there was a hair in the food, or there was a hair in her private parts. And he got so angry with her that she ran away. And as a result of her running away, the whole story happened till eventually he pila kamer of Yisrael. She caused the death of his causing her to be scared of him and run away caused many Jews to die. Amar Rav Yehuda Amarav. Also, he said something similar. If you do this, you're going to come to 3 sins, terrible sins. Giloy arayot, because if your wife is scared of you, let's say she doesn't want to go to the mikveh, the water's too cold. She'll lie to you and say she went to the mikveh because she's scared to come home and say, I didn't go to the mikveh tonight. So then you'll end up sleeping with your wife when she's in nida. That's giloy arayot. Shvichut amim. Here they say potentially she could run away from you and fall into a pit, I just did it. Like I was rushing and I sliced my finger. I actually did twice in the last few weeks, right? Because when you're rushing or you're scared of something, right? In that case, I was just rushing. But, when you're scared of something, it causes you to do silly things and you could die actually. And chilul Shabbat, because the food might not be cooked properly before Shabbat, and she'll cook on Shabbat so that the food gets cooked properly because she's scared what her husband's going to say when he gets to the table and the Shabbos food isn't ready. So, or, the food is raw. So now, last line for today. Amar Rabbi Rav Kahana, Hada Amri Rabbanan, Shlosha Dvarim Tzarich Adam Lamar B'toch Beito Erev Shabbat Im Chashicha. This is explicit Mishnah. We say it in Bameh Madlikin on Friday nights in Shul, if you say that. So there's three things a man has to say Friday afternoon before Shabbat starts, and presumably saying it to his wife. Isartem, did you do the maskot so we can eat our produce on Shabbat? Eravtem, did you do an eruv so we can carry? Hadliku etanir. If so, then it's time to light the candle. This, you have to say it nicely so that she'll accept it. You can't say, did you do this? Did you do that? Right? In that kind of way. And by the way, this is obviously goes in both directions, right? I would get criticism in my house. I don't say things nicely sometimes. So, you also, it's not only the husband to the wife, but the wife to the husband. They were more talking to the men, but it obviously goes in both directions. In a relationship, if you want someone to listen to me, you should say it nicely. Someone after the Hebrew class just now told me that in her house, her father used to sing this, which is really a kiyum of this line. So anyway, that's today's stop. I'll do a very quick review. We started with this machloket about what part has to be seen of the writing to say it was written l'shma. Then we brought a braita to strengthen Rav Ashi's position that you could even just hear. And then we had some question on that braita about the second part, nichnas v'yotzei, who is it talking to? Then we started with this big machloket, Rav and Shmuel, about Babylonia. Is it like Israel? Is it like outside of Israel for the Inyan Gittin? What's the root of the machloket? And basically, right, do they recognize signatures or not? Are they busy with their learning or not? And then we brought a chizuk that this has to do with all the yeshivas, the fact that there's a lot of yeshivas. And then we asked a question on Rav and we answered it. Rav Yomi asked the question and answered it himself from our Mishnah. Okay, then we said, what are the boundaries of Bavel? Then we talked about different places or different types of places, like across the street, across the Rishut HaRabim, and what you needed. And we basically said those were exceptions to the rule in those places where you needed it because people really didn't know signatures because they traveled a lot. Then we had stories about people bringing gets, right? We had this Rav Kahana brought the get from Shiur to Naharda, or the reverse. And then we said, you don't have to say it, but if you do, it's good. And then we had this whole thing about, well, it's helpful. It's helpful because then the woman won't have to start searching, but you don't have to do it. And we brought this braita of Rabbi Yishmael and his whole story to prove that. Then we moved on to this Rabbi Evyatar. And then we said, do you have to bring? And he basically said, no, you don't have to bring, right? If you bring from Babylonia to Israel, you don't have to bring it. And then we had the whole question, could you really rely on him? And Abaye said, why wouldn't you rely on him? Right? Even though he didn't do the sirtut, but that's not a big deal. And even God agreed with him. And from there, we got off on a whole tangent of his Rashan Pilegesh Begiva. And from there, we got to some lessons about how to speak in your household so that people will actually listen to you. That's like those books they say, how to speak so your children will listen. So anyway, some good advice for today. Have a great day, everybody.